Hello, welcome to Community Problem Solving Coaches Training Part 3, the Written Report. Community Problem Solving is a program of the Indiana Future Problem Solving Program, which is a program of the Indiana Association of School Principals, Department of Student Programs. My name is Jill Slinker, and I am the Director of the Department of Student Programs. So let's talk about the Community Problem Solving Project Written Report. You've experienced the problem-solving process and put things into place for your teams. Now, all projects that are going to be submitted for a competition must have a written report, which includes a report on the problem-solving process that you took, and then the implementation of that process and the outcomes of the process. Then, at the competition itself, you will present your efforts in a science fair style presentation with an interview. So let's talk about what we're dealing with here. The evaluation criteria for the community problem solving project is as follows. The first part of it, worth 120 points, deals just directly with the problem solving process itself. And this is judged in your written report. When you talked about your area of concern, gave background, all that, you identified your challenges, you discussed the underlying problem, you discussed alternative solution ideas, and your plan of action. Each section of that is worth 30 points on the rubric. The next part of that includes the implementation and outcomes of your project. If you do global issues problem solving, the first circle represents the creative problem solving process. Now, because we're doing community problem solving, we are taking our plan of action and putting it into play. And so the implementation and the outcomes of the plan are graded in the next section. That section overall is worth 260 points. We're looking for the actions that you've taken and the outcomes to date. The organization, how did you break up the jobs? Who was in charge of what, and how did you organize the work that you needed to do? Resource identification and utilization. Where did you get your information? How did you engage members of the community? How did you do your research? Then your accomplishments. Notice that the rest of it is worth 30 points each. Accomplishments, we're going for 70 points here, because this truly is about solving a problem in the community. Then there's a reflection piece on the outcomes. When you evaluate your own process and see what you could have done better, what worked for you, and why you think those things worked, and how you would change if you needed to change. Then the scope of the project. Is this an important project? Does it truly affect the intended audience the way you would like it to do so? The next section is graded as presentation, but these first two are truly the written report. So the third section is in the presentation. Now notice, as we said, circles 1 and 2, all of that is included in the written report. Section 3 is the presentation that is done. Now, some affiliates don't do this presentation until they send a team on to the international competition. In Indiana, we are going to do a modified version of this. And that version omits the media presentation or the public service announcement. We will leave that for the international conference if your team moves on, but we will ask you to include the addendum, which essentially is a mini scrapbook. The scrapbook, you will create a display at the state competition, and you will go through an interview process, okay? So all of that is included. The rest of this presentation is going to talk to you more specifically about each part. So part 2 talked about the problem-solving process, and I guided you in part 2 to also go to Marion Rutledge's 6-step problem-solving process videos that we have posted for the global issues problem-solving, because they go into each of those steps in far more depth. But in your report, you are going to reflect on the problem-solving process, and we need to see all 6 steps reported, okay? So the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to describe the area of concern, and that is the situation that you are trying to address. Give background, give research, and let us know what the true problem is. Then the next step of the process is challenging or identifying those challenges. What are the sub-challenges of the area of concern? What types of things did you consider? Basically, you're looking for a clear description of the many challenges that the community is facing. Remember, this is what the community is facing, not what the students are facing in trying to solve the problem. Okay, the students should look at issues that cause the concern, as well as those that are the result of the situation. Okay. The next is the underlying problem. So after examining all of the challenges, you need to create goals based on your analysis of the challenges. You need to find what you consider to be the underlying problem to all of this that you can solve, that you can take steps to solve. There must be direct relevance to the area of concern. We've got to clearly communicate the goals and the desired outcomes of your project here. Alternative solution ideas. So we know what the problem is. What are the possible ways we could go about trying to solve that particular problem? Your area of concern is going to be very general. You're going to identify many types of challenges with that area of concern, but you're going to focus on the one challenge. How are we going to solve that one problem, and then generate possible solution ideas? Okay. Once you have created those possible solution ideas and decided which one of those ideas you are going to run with, then you have the plan of action. So you're going to be writing this after, well after you are putting things together, but you need to make sure that the report itself reflects the process of problem solving that your team has gone through from the beginning to the end. So again, the area of concern should describe the significance of your project, the magnitude of the issue, and how the community is impacted by that. Is the importance clearly defined? How and why did the students become involved? Was the thought process that you gave easy to follow? We don't grade on grammar, but we do need to be able to present these ideas clearly. Okay. The next part is the challenges identified. You'll be graded on flexibility. Did your challenges reflect a variety of viewpoints that you explored while analyzing the situation? You'll be graded on insight. Do you seem to understand the complexity of the problems? Are you sensitive to those directly involved? Are your concerns of the community noted? And clarity, the manner in which students communicate their ideas. Notice you're always going to be graded on clarity, not necessarily on, is the comma in the right place, but on clarity. Now, remember that the challenges you're identifying here are the challenges of the community that is experiencing the problem you're trying to solve, not your challenge as a team. Okay, so this has to be, what is this particular community who's experiencing this problem? What challenges do you identify for them, not necessarily for your team? So the underlying problem, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this because this is the key to being able to solve all of these problems, is truly understanding what the underlying problem is. Okay. In global issues problem solving, this is often abbreviated to the UP. So if I call it the UP, that's what we're dealing with. Basically, we want to know, did the underlying problem logically develop from the area of concern? Is there a logical relationship, a connection between them? Focus. Did you look at the scope of the whole situation and narrow down the area of concern to something that is manageable? All right. And then the clarity, again, of your desired outcomes. Did you express your goals and your outcomes clearly? Now, there's a prescribed format for writing an underlying problem. There are 4 elements of that format. The first one is the condition phrase, which is essentially the rationale for what you are doing. You're setting up a clear cause-effect relationship, okay? So because this situation occurs, how might we fix it, okay? So we look at the condition phrase. The stem phrase is always going to be one of 2 things. How might we, or in what ways might we? All right, so that's the stem. It just plugs in. So you give a rationale and then ask, how might we, and then your key verb phrase. You need one verb. You shouldn't use absolute verbs like solve, okay? Or we'll just stay with solve, okay? You don't need to use absolute verbs here. You've got to use others. I'll give you some examples here in a minute. But how might we increase the number of students who, or how might we enhance an experience? But you want one key verb there. And then include the purpose. So how might we increase the number of students involved so that, and what's your purpose? So that they are safe after school in a program, right? Then the project parameters, we need to know the topic, the time, the place. So, if your parameters are for one town, are we talking about students in Indianapolis in 2019, 2020? Or are you talking about patients in local hospitals in rural areas? Give me your parameters. Be specific about who you're talking about, when this is supposed to take place, and where this is taking place. So when I talk about not using absolute verbs, consider these verbs instead. Things like alter, or arrange, or assist, or change, or combine. None of those are absolutes. When you're writing, you're told to avoid words like only, right? Because it eliminates every other possibility. So this is part of the logic. You want to increase or improve. You're not solving. You're not fixing anything, but you need, yes, we do call it problem solving. But for example, think about this, if your goal is to solve world hunger, your plan is probably not going to work. You need a smaller bite. What are we doing? How are we fixing their lives? How are we fixing the situation? Are we trying to manage something or introduce something or increase something? Just kind of focus on some of these verbs here. Now, here's an example from a project that was written by students from Singapore. And this is the underlying problem. They were discussing an increase in the instances of type 2 diabetes in youth, okay? So was Project DiaBEATes. We have the condition phrase at the beginning. Given that Singapore experiences a steady increase in diabetics, with 1 in 2 Singaporeans facing the risk of contracting diabetes in 2050, notice here's the situation. Here is the situation that they are addressing. Here's the condition. How might we, that's the stem, okay? How might we, or in what ways might we, how might we increase the number of youths willing to commit to healthy lifestyle changes necessary? So their key verb phrase, increase the number of youths willing to commit, okay? So we have that key verb phrase. And then we need the purpose. We have the so that. That's the other phrase that's, that's going to be stuck in there. So the next thing that they tell us is going to be the purpose. So why do you want to increase the number of youths willing to commit to healthy lifestyle changes? You want to do it so that they reduce their risk of contracting type 2 diabetes, right? You notice you're not curing type 2 diabetes. You're not eliminating type 2 diabetes. You are reducing risk of contracting. That's something that is manageable, that you can achieve, right? And then we give the parameters. This is in Singapore in 2015 and beyond. So we know the place, we know the who, the 13 to 18-year-olds, we know the place, Singapore, and we know the time, 2015 and beyond. So if you follow the format for the underlying problem, you'll have all of the parts that you need for it. So once you finish the UP, the underlying problem, we need to explore the alternative solution ideas, right? We know what our problem is. Well, what are some of the ways? You've asked that question. In what ways might we? Or, how can we do this? All of your alternative solution ideas have to go back to the underlying problem. Okay, so they want to increase youth's understanding. Let's try this again. Let's go back here, right? Increase the number of youths willing to commit to healthy lifestyle changes. So every solution that they give should be about youth and committing to lifestyle changes. So what are they going to do to get that to happen? Flexibility, we demonstrate a variety of ways to respond to that. There are, lots of different possibilities, and we offer a variety of perspectives. So again, we're going to grade on clarity. Is it an effective explanation of the solution ideas? Are they easy to understand? Now, we're not grading on a specific number of solutions, but they should represent a thorough examination of the issue itself. Next thing was the plan of action. So what is your group's proposal to solve the underlying problem? Your plan of action should be relevant to the underlying problem, and you'll be judged on how effectively the plan responds to that underlying problem. We're going to look at the potential impact on the area of concern. This will essentially measure the influence of the plan that the plan will have on that area of concern. Do you have a really important problem and a trivial answer or a trivial plan? That's not going to reflect well. And we're also looking at the completeness. Do you delineate milestones? Have you included your timeline? And that is something that needs to be included in the written report, is your timeline. So let's think about this. The plan of action essentially represents what the students expect to accomplish and the steps they plan to take to accomplish it. You'll include a working timeline outlining major goals and deadlines, demonstrate relevance to the underlying problem. We look to see that you've provided a rationale for each section or each selection of solution ideas. You'll describe the impact that the students believe the plan will have on the area of concern and explain why it's the best way to solve the problem. The plan of action should be thorough, describing both activities to be carried out and how success will be evaluated. Here are some, different examples of timelines. They can be quite creative here, and it's always good to have a creative visual. The timeline on the left with the light bulbs is a timeline about energy conservation. So it makes sense to have light bulbs as their visual representation of energy conservation. The timeline on the right went a completely different way. You have a traditional timeline in the middle with multicolored boxes, but you also have photographs of students as they are doing the project. So, different ways of looking at things. So to recap the scoring of this, the area of concern is 30 points, challenges identified, 30 points, underlying problem, 30 points, alternative solution ideas, 30 points, and plan of action, 30 points. So let's look at the next section, the implementation and the outcome. So the implementation and outcomes, they essentially describe the actions that you have taken and how you've taken them, okay? And basically everything on the left of the light bulb here is based on your accomplishments up to the point of submitting the written report. It will include proposed efforts still to be completed. So, this is what you're planning on doing, you just haven't gotten to it yet. That needs to be included as well. This essentially includes part 2 and part 4 of the written report. Part 3 is another part, and we'll talk about that after a little bit, but part 2 and part 4 of the written report include these 2 sections. So the actions and outcomes, we're going to look for scoring criteria for that. We're going to look at the progress that you've made. We're going to look at your successful implementation, your adaptation of your plan as it was necessary, and evidence of effort. This describes the actions the students have taken and the results of their problem-solving activities. The report should cite activities leading to successful implementation of the plan, adjustments that you had to make in the plan, and the steps taken toward implementing the remaining portions of the plan. So include all the actions taken before submission of the report and the addendum. Activities planned for completion after the submission deadline should also be described to clarify the current status of the project for the evaluators. The focus should be on what has been accomplished so far. Later accomplishments can be reported on site and in other materials during the interview process. The organization here, the scoring criteria for organization is clarity, systematic approach to tasks, and involvement of participants. In all the teams and individual CmPS projects, organization is important to the successful implementation of the plan of action. Teams reports should indicate how the work was assigned, who carried out which tasks. Teams might divide themselves into committees or task forces and describe the responsibilities of each. That's a fine way to do it. If you're doing this as an individual, you need to say who helped, who worked through all of this. Next one is resource identification and utilization. So the criteria here for scoring is thoroughness, flexibility, and evidence of outreach. So the report should describe resources used in creating and implementing the plan of action, resources such as agencies and people consulted, research used, media contacts that, who should be identified and utilized, outreach into the community, the community particularly that is identified in the area of concern should be demonstrated in this. Now, project outcomes, right? Even though this section isn't evaluated in the pre-IC scoring, it's an important part of the 6-page report. Evaluators will keep the project outcomes in mind when forming interview questions and when scoring efforts, and your accomplishments. So project outcomes are scored on-site on the IC, okay? You'll see it at the state evaluation as well. More information may be included in the on-site supporting documentation. So if you move on from the state competition and are invited to the international competition, there will be things that you add to the report and add to the project at that point. And then it'll all be folded into the addendum and the scoring for that. Okay. So any other changes in the project will be reflected through to your supporting information, your scrapbooks, your addendum, etc. So your initial written report will remain essentially the same, and then you will add onto it with the presentation after that point. Okay, so the actions and the outcomes to date section. This is where you tell us where your progress, what your progress was made to accomplishing your underlying problem, your underlying problem, solving your underlying problem. There you go. The successful implementation and the adaptation of the plan. This is where we're judging evidence of effort, okay? And Everything that's described in the written report is scored prior to the presentation of the project. So the presentation is going to be scored separately. Your organization, we're looking for, is there a clear line of responsibilities and assignments, a systematic approach to tasks, and the involvement of the participants. So is this one person doing all of the work, or does this involve all of the students? We need to, and they need to be involved in planning and executing the activities to the ability of their level. So resource identification and utilization, how thorough were you? That's what we're going to grade on. Do the responsibilities reflect the elements of the plan of action? Right? Have tasks been allocated in a strategic manner? Is there evidence that students reached out to members of the community, reached out to other students, that they are involved in the planning and executing the activities? So next section is on the accomplishments. Does this reflect the work accomplished and progress toward the project's goal? How do we know what happened? Do the responsibilities reflect the elements of the plan of action, right? Effectiveness of problem solving. Did it work out? The impact on the area of concern in the UP. We need to look at all of these things. Notice with all these sections, we consider the student's level of involvement in planning and executing the activities. Then the reflection. This is where the students examine their process. How complete is it? Did they really assess their project? Is it thoughtful? Did we give attention to the process itself? Did you consider areas for improvement? How accurate was it? Okay, did you acknowledge both the successes and the failures in the project? And then the scope of the project. The scope describes the work completed. How did the students engage their community? Do project outcomes align with the originally stated objectives? Does it have anything to do with the goals that were identified by the UP? So to recap, the written report, which is a maximum of 5,500 words and a one-page timeline doesn't count in the word count limit, should be typed in 12-point font, Times New Roman, single or double spaced. Now, it will be divided essentially into 5 parts. You have your project overview, which discusses the problem-solving process, A to E there. Part 2 is the implementation of the plan. What were the actions and outcomes to date, the organization that you use, the resource identification and utilization. Part 3 is the addendum. What have you added to your project to support what you are saying? Basically, part 3 is the mini outcome or the mini scrapbook part. Part 4, project outcomes. What were your accomplishments and reflection on those outcomes, reflections on those processes. And then part 5 is the supporting information. We're going to talk more in the next presentation about the presentation part of it, and that's supporting information. But supporting information here may be your research sources. It may be copies of letters to legislators. It may be photographs of what you have done so far. All of that, newspaper articles, all that can be supporting information. So this is the end of part 3. Part 4 is coming up with information on the presentation part of the project.